എല്ലാവർക്കും പ്രാപ്യമായ ഒരു കൂട്ടായ്മയ്ക്ക് രൂപം കൊടുക്കാനുള്ള ശ്രമമാണ് ഞങ്ങളുടേത്. ഈ പരമ്പരയിലെ പ്രഭാഷണങ്ങൾ മലയാളം, ഹിന്ദി, ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് തുടങ്ങിയ ഭാഷകളിൽ ഒറ്റയ്ക്കോ സംയുക്തമായോ ആയിരിക്കും നടക്കുന്നത്. കൂടാതെ അവ ഇന്ത്യൻ ആംഗ്യ ഭാഷയിലേക്ക് തർജ്ജമ ചെയ്യാനുള്ള പരിശ്രമത്തിലുമാണ്. ഒരു പുതിയ വിദ്യാഭ്യാസ സ്ഥാപനം എന്ന നിലയ്ക്ക് ന്യൂനപക്ഷ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളെയും അധ്യാപകരെയും പ്രവർത്തകരെയും ഉൾക്കൊള്ളിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് സമദർശിയായ ധാർമ്മികത്വമുള്ള ഒരു പഠനാന്തരീക്ഷം കെട്ടിപ്പടുക്കുന്നതിനായി സമാന തൽപരരായ തദ്ദേശ സംഘടനകളുമായി ഞങ്ങൾ സമ്പർക്കത്തിലാണ്. അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ ഞങ്ങളുടെ സ്ഥാപനത്തിൻ്റെ അടിസ്ഥാന സൗകര്യങ്ങളടക്കം എല്ലാവിധ സാങ്കേതിക വിഭവങ്ങളും പൊതുസമൂഹത്തിന് കൂടി ഉപയോഗപ്രദമാക്കുക എന്നതും ഞങ്ങളുടെ പ്രധാന ലക്ഷ്യമാണ്. അനസ്യൂതം നടക്കുന്ന ഈ പ്രവൃത്തിയിൽ ക്ഷമയോടെ ഞങ്ങൾക്കൊപ്പം നിൽക്കുന്നതിന് ഞങ്ങൾ നന്ദി അറിയിക്കുന്നതിനോടൊപ്പം വിലപ്പെട്ട നിർദ്ദേശങ്ങൾ യാതൊരു മടിയും കൂടാതെ ഞങ്ങളെ അറിയിക്കാൻ താല്പര്യപ്പെടുന്നു. അവനി പ്രഭാഷണ ശില്പശാല പരമ്പരയുമായോ മറ്റേതെങ്കിലും പൊതുപരിപാടികളുമായോ ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് നിങ്ങളുടെ സംശയങ്ങളും അന്വേഷണങ്ങളും ഞങ്ങളെ അറിയിക്കുവാനായി ujayant@avani.edu.in, ദേവകുമാർ@avani.edu.in എന്നിവരുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെടുക. താങ്ക് യു.
Thank you, Dev Kumar. So it is my duty to introduce our speaker today. It is with great pleasure we invite Professor Vishwanath Shrikantaiah, a great mentor to all of us. Professor Vishwanath Shrikantaiah is a water conservation expert who is renowned for his tireless and pioneering efforts to find solutions to country's water crisis. Popularly, he is known as Zen Rain Man on all social media channels, and also publishes articles on water and environmental issues frequently, and he also appears in mainstream news publications. He is a civil engineer and urban planner by qualification. Professor Vishwanath worked with Housing and Urban Development Corporation, HUDCO, for over 14 years before dedicating himself full-time to solving water issues facing urban and rural communities. He is a trustee of Biome Environmental Trust, an organization assisting communities in water and sanitation solutions. He is a director of Biome Environmental Solutions Private Limited, an architectural firm specializing in sustainable design, and an adjunct faculty at the Azim Premji University. It is with great pleasure to have you here with us. We have students from several semesters, especially students. So we look forward to this lecture to give insights on some of these issues.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for setting up a wonderful set of ideas to challenge the students and to work with as an agenda, which your college has done. The statement itself, building voices, building alliances, is such an interesting concept and such a relevant topic, concept for our times. And it's good that as part of the journey, students are going to get involved, and students will hopefully reach out to communities and individuals all across and do a process of knowledge sharing, knowledge building, and knowledge learning as things go along. And thank you for having called me here. Apologies, I couldn't turn up some days back because I was down with COVID. So now I'm on the path of recovery. The voice may sometimes be a bit hazy, so apologies on that front. So let me just start to share some of my experiences on the journey that I have had in this space. I hope my screen is visible now.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes.
And I hope it's moving also.
Yeah, it's moving. Sir.
Perfect. So just wanted to share these experiences, and I've sort of titled this as knowledge, livelihoods, ecology, and the design challenge of what I call solutionism. And so the fundamental question that I ask myself as I continue my work in the field with people is how knowledge seems to exist in such various domains and such various forms, and how difficult it is for one form of knowledge to try and understand or empathize with other forms of knowledge. And I'll show it to you with some example. For me, the heart of all our solutions and the whole of the human endeavor of design is and should be based around livelihoods. It's the job of us as designers, as practitioners, as architects, as planners, as engineers, to make sure that what we do enhances livelihoods, enhances the quality of life, enhances livelihoods, and provides more and more opportunities for living, because we are living in an era of great economic challenges. And with climate change, global warming, ecology, the loss of biodiversity, pollution, as we now see, ecology or biodiversity and the environment is facing one of its greatest challenges. And so therefore I come to this term called solutionism, the design challenge of solutionism. Solutionism is something that grips every technologist. There is a belief that every problem has a solution based in technology. Unfortunately, it's a seductive idea, it's a powerful idea. And as Evgeny Morozov, this Belarusian but now United States citizen, if you listen to him on YouTube or other places, or you read his books, as he argues, fundamentally problems that arise in the real world are political in nature. And then therefore to seek solutions only through technology is to be reductionist ad absurdum. And it's very absurd to do that. So therefore the dangers of solutionism is something that we have to remind ourselves constantly as we approach defining problems and trying to approach solutions. So let me begin with some examples of what I mean and how we deal with issues. The red line represents sewage flow from a particular town. This is untreated sewage, untreated wastewater as you would have it. It leaves the town, it flows in channels, and then moves out and reaches a particular river. Now, close to that untreated sewage flows in this particular farm that you see a pit in the front, right? The pit is a hole or a pond dug by a farmer, and it collects all untreated sewage, untreated wastewater. Now, this untreated wastewater is being pumped to irrigate lands, right? Now, in a conventional paradigm, as an engineer, if I have to think about it, or as a designer, if one has to think about it, you would say that this is something that is completely unacceptable. It's unacceptable that sewage flows untreated in drains. It's unacceptable that it is being used for a particular purpose, in this case, particularly irrigation. And here's Muniraju. From a livelihoods perspective, when I talk about systems, I'll talk from a livelihoods and the knowledge perspective. Muniraju is a farmer adjacent to the town. You see the town in the background, those small buildings that are cropping up. And the three people who are working in the field are part of Muniraju's family, his wife and two sons who are working on the field. Muniraju has about 6 hectares of land. He had a borewell dug in his land, and that borewell was providing all the irrigation water required. And suddenly one day the borewell went dry. So Muniraju went from being a relatively prosperous farmer on 6 hectares of land to somebody who had to work on other people's lands because his land was only rain-fed and he could only cultivate rain-fed crops, right? So Muniraju realized, along with his family and his knowledge system, that sewage or that wastewater flowing beside his farm could potentially be a resource which he could use in his farm, right? And so that's what he did. He picked it up in a pit. He started to pump it, and he used a form of irrigation called furrow irrigation. What you see here is furrows, or furrows where the wastewater flows, and the crop that he grows is a crop called mulberry. Now, mulberry is an interesting crop. It's a non-edible crop. So therefore, what Muniraju has done is, by growing a non-edible crop, he's de-risked any consumer of edible crops who may be subject to this wastewater input and affecting the crops and therefore their health, right? So by growing a non-edible crop, he's made things safe for consumers. By using furrow irrigation, he's made things safer for himself and the family who work on the land. And therefore, now the entire wastewater flowing from the town of Vijaypura is completely used up by a set of farmers like Muniraju, and they turn the landscape lush green. Even in drought years, even in hot summer years, you'll find mulberry growing in these large fields. The mulberry itself is then used to feed the silkworm. The silkworm is a traditional cultural crop in this particular area. The rearing of the silkworm is a traditional practice going on for about 300 years. The silkworm does two things. It eats the mulberry and turns it into cocoon, but it also certifies the quality of the mulberry leaf, or therefore the quality of the wastewater treatment. So it's doing a functional deed as well as an indicator deed. It's a bioindicator. This is how the silkworms are fed by these mulberry leaves in these trays in small homes, and there's a premium paid for the mulberry leaves which Muniraju grows. The silkworms then become cocoons as such, and the cocoon rearing is another livelihood, a set of livelihood which again a set of people practice. Their job is to feed mulberry leaf to the silkworms and grow these cocoons and sell the cocoon in the market. These are how the silk cocoons look like. Then the silk cocoons are then turned into yarn using small power looms and sometimes hand looms. And this is another set of livelihood people who are working on converting the cocoons to yarn, right? And then there's a third and there's a final set of people who convert this silk yarn itself to silk saris. All this is happening around the town of Vijaypura, and the transformative process that has taken place is that wastewater from toilets of Vijaypura are being transformed into silk saris. In the process, providing livelihoods for a whole set of people. If you look at the health risks and the environmental risks, when we did a quick study, we found that the environmental risk is virtually non-existent because groundwater tables are at 900 feet and there's no contamination of either surface water sources or groundwater sources. There's no contamination of the soil because the mulberry plant takes up all these wastewater and converts it to leaves. There's no health risk to the farm workers because Muniraju practices furrow irrigation and nobody comes into direct contact with wastewater. And there, the farm workers have had a practice of washing their hands and feet every day after work. And so therefore, there's no ingestion of the wastewater also. The biggest threat in these fields is from the use of insecticides and pesticides and herbicides and weedicides, which is legally mandated by the state. There is no threat at all from wastewater. Therefore, there has been a transformation of what is otherwise seen as a pollution in the ecosystem through a knowledge system that Muniraju and farmers like Muniraju have perfected over 10,000 years of agriculture. They bring this domain knowledge to bear, and conventionally, we would have demanded a sewage treatment plant and the running of the sewage treatment plant and the treatment of the sewage and then the disposal into the environment. But unconventionally, the farmers like Muniraju have converted their farmland to sewage treatment plants. The challenge before us is, do we accept this practice? Do we improve on this practice? Do we continue with this practice? Because otherwise it is legally not permitted. It's illegal, right? So how do we deal with these knowledge streams and these solutions that emerge, which provides for livelihoods, which provides for enhancement of the quality of life of a lot of people involved in the sector is a challenge that I face in my day-to-day work. One problem, a problem if identified as solutionism would mean that we would find a technical solution, but what farmers have done is found a livelihood solution using farmland. Here's another set of example that I want to give to you. This is something called a honeysucker, a vacuum sucking truck, right? This yellow colored one. It's prevalent in almost all towns and even rural areas of India because a lot of people have pit toilets or septic tanks, and these septic tanks and pit toilets have to be emptied frequently. Now these honeysucker people come, they empty the pit toilets. This is the city of Bangalore that I'm talking about. Then they take it again to the periphery where farmers like Muniraju dig compost pits. And they allow this honeysucker to empty the waste into the compost pit. They cover this whole waste with earth and leave it for 6 months to compost, right? And then this compost bit itself becomes excellent manure, sells for about 2,000, now actually 3,500 rupees a truckload. Again, waste from pit toilet septic tanks being transformed by bacteria to good compost. The compost then is used to grow crops like bananas, grapes, which in turn becomes wine. Now, there's a transformation of human waste in pit toilets and septic tanks done through innovative honeysuckers users and farmers who are using the land as a transformative space to convert it into a useful product for human beings without impacting their health or the environment negatively. Again, how do we accept and work with these practices is a challenge that comes before us, because in the conventional paradigm, this is not seen as a solution. This is actually identified as a problem. So knowledge systems, livelihoods interact with what resources or waste is available in society and can be transformative if we are accepting them. Another set of practices that I want to talk about, the old in the new. How do we merge and think of the old set of practices which came to us from as traditional knowledge and embed it in the modern societal context? This is the tank irrigation system of South India. History tells us inscription stones like this, which I'm showing you, these are beautiful inscription stones carved in granite in our part of the world, that the tank irrigation system or the lake irrigation system in South India, and especially in Bangalore, dates something like 870 AD, right? This is about 1100 to 1200 year old. 1200 year old back, our ancestors through earthen dams across valleys and impounded water in what are called tanks or lakes. This is how a tank or a lake ecosystem looks like. Water flows from a catchment like a rock, comes down the landscape, is held together and stored in the rainy season for use in summertime. It also recharges the ground, as you can see in the figure on the right, and brings up the groundwater table, which then can be used through wells. Yeah. So this is how a tank ecosystem looks like. The figure on the right is the photo on the right is showing you the earthen bund lined with stones, which holds on to the water. And that's the water-filled tank in the dry semi-arid district of Kolar, next to Bangalore. There's something called a wasteware. A wasteware is a place where the water, when it fills the tank, overflows, like as you can see here, and then it fills up the next downstream tank. Now, the design of the wasteware, as done by communities, not just considers the amount of water that is required by their village alone, but what is required by the villages downstream too, right? So it's a community effort designing a series of tanks or a chain of tanks, and the wasteware embodies the height or the ecological capacity that a village is allowed to do based on the rainfall capacity there and the availability of the resource. Now, this has been historically worked upon for thousands of years and arrived at as a conclusion. And historically, livelihoods have emerged around these tank ecosystems. The gentlemen that you see on the left from the Dalit community are called Nirugantis. Now, traditionally, they were responsible for the distribution of the water from these tanks or these lakes, right? So they would determine how much water has arrived during the monsoon season, therefore, which crop could be grown. They would determine how the water would be distributed and how much area of cultivation would be permitted in what is called the command area, right? And they would also make sure that the water flow was equally given to every field. In return, they were given food grains as part of the produce which the command area provided. Now, there are systemic inequities in this power equilibrium, but given that the power inequilibrium has to also be addressed, this was a system which was functional. And there's also a traditional cultural approach by which floats, what you see in the right is a float to Gangama, which was released in the tanks by the Niruganti community whenever the gods were munificent enough to fill the tanks and the tank overflowed, right? So there was a cultural heritage and the cultural representation of the fullness of nature represented by the festival of Gangama. And then itself, the water flowed down into the command area and people use it to grow paddy. And they've been growing paddy for many, many years, right? And so this is the lush landscape of an arid area with the traditional water harvesting system called the tank. And you see that women are part of the whole process. There's a gender patriarchy issue here, but women are the ones who do the hardest work of paddy cultivation. How can they therefore become involved in the modern system of the revival of the tank and provide themselves a bit more equity, a bit more gender balance? Now, what's happening in certain communities where we work with is that the women engage in cleaning up the channels which feed the lakes in the summer season. They get a fair wage, they get a higher wage than what they would get under Narega, and they form themselves into teams and make sure that all these feeder channels are desilted and the water comes into the lake. They also make sure that the distribution channels in the command area, in the land, to distribute the water is also cleaned and ready so that when the water comes, it fills up the tank and is ready for distribution in the fields. So when the water does come, they have much more employment again, because 2 crops can be grown with the water so harvested. So by giving agency to Dalit women in the maintenance of the tank, in the rehabilitation of the tank, through fair wages, through income, their capacity to engage with the whole ecosystem is enhanced, the ecology of the tank is maintained, preserved, and the food security of the village and of the farmers who cultivate this land is also ensured. So somewhere along the lines, we have to think of the new notions of knowledge, the new disequilibriums which we are able to identify, the power inequities, and be able to address it with the kind of solutions that we think. Now, these solutions are social. They're not technical. Here, what you're seeing is an engagement and an agency given to women Dalit workers so that they become part of the solution through their own work, right? So constructs of water shortage can be addressed through various means, and one of the means is social engagement through livelihoods. Now, this is what then happens, transformative landscape, and rice paddy is cultivated, and the paddy itself is then used as a distribution first in the village, and only surpluses are sent to the market in this particular place, right? So these become visual treats, great, beautiful ecological designs. People pay an arm and a leg to go to Bali to see the terrace fields, but what you see here is also a cultural heritage that we have of rice paddy being cultivated, of it ripening, and of us being in tune with the seasons, with the kind of work that is done through livelihoods enhancement and ecological regeneration. And in this space, what then happens is that the wells that you see, the groundwater table also is enhanced and the water becomes available. As you see, there's a whole regeneration of the aquifers and groundwater, and this then becomes the water available during summertime when the tank can go dry as its ecosystem. And in this whole system, there is an architectural expression that people have evolved. 2 communities called the Manwaddars who dig these wells, and the Kalluwaddars who line these wells with stones. And this is a prosaic well. It's a well in a farmer's field, right? It's not a glorious step well, which we have seen in many books and many architectural forms. But this is an ordinary well in a slightly richer farmer's field. And look at the beauty of the construction. Now, if the tank ecosystem is maintained, the well will have water and it becomes functional as a heritage. How do we therefore work with cultural and water heritage in a functional fashion and make sure that it is continued and maintained is some of the challenges that we face as designers as we work in our landscapes, right? And each landscape is varied. Every village is different, every tank is different, every city is different, as you will learn when you carry out your practice. Now, with the regeneration of these tanks and lakes, you get drinking water security for the village also. You see the well there in the midst of the tank, and you see that the well has absolutely crystal clear water. Otherwise, in a land full of fluoride and high salinity in groundwater, open wells and tank ecosystems deliver to you sweet water right through the year, provided you go to the well and you lift the water with your buckets, with your pots, and then you bring it home. You don't put a pump. The moment you put a pump, you seem to create disequilibriums. So this is how systems are functioning. And the thing is that it's also dynamic, that there's a constant endeavor to keep a balance. Things can go wrong very quickly, and things need good attention all the time from communities to make sure that they are stable as they can be. And the tank ecosystem also helps the non-landowners. They help the people who rear sheep and goat and cattle, the cattle grazers, and they therefore are also included as part of the tank's benefits to the village. The major concern that comes in this rehabilitation of these water structures is, what do you do with people who are landless? And the way to be inclusive about them is to A, ensure fair wages to them in the work they do. B, if there are fishing rights, then the fishing rights is then given to the landless, and that the landless are included as part of the firewood and cultivation that happens, and the grass that is raised here for fodder for cattle and sheep, and that they have a steady source of income and a right to the water that they are responsible for, right? Now that's at a small, at a village level. This is the peri-urban and the village level. This I picked up in terms of the engagements that we have with nature at an urban level, right? So there are 3 models that we can think of in terms of ecological regeneration. And for me, the livelihoods are at the center of it. So there is one, which is the nature for nature's sake, right? So you rehabilitate an old forest because the old forest and the biodiversity in the old forest is necessary for its own sake, right? So nature for nature. Then there is nature for society. So the forest is rehabilitated because it provides us honey, it provides us wood, and therefore we can use the benefits from these forests. So they're nature for society. And then nature as culture, as a place which we then inhabited. As for example, in the tanks, when we put a float of Gangama, or as a place where we do worship or other activities centered around cultural activities around it. So these are three domains of engagement with nature in our urban context, in our local community context, and each one of them is relevant for its own cause. The best would be a combination of all three. So this is the framework that has been given. This is an article from Science Direct where I pick up, and I'll give you the references in the end. So to look at it from a relational perspective, to look at it from an intrinsic value perspective, and to look at it from a utilitarian perspective. Utilitarian in the sense of what benefits it brings to us. All three need to be merged carefully in terms of design interventions, if at all they are done. And all three should be done in dialogue with the communities, who then have the right to decide how or what an intervention should look like. Because there are dependencies and independencies. One of the factors that we've worked on, a lot of flavor of design has been for independent design, off the grid design, as it is called, design which keeps us independent of societies. And I'll talk a bit about it. Is there an arrogance of independence? Is there a humility of dependence? Because after all, we're connected to the web of life, and no man is an island, to quote one proverb, and nothing can function on its own. We're all connected to society, we're all connected to nature, and therefore how much of dependency and independency should we work on is a question that we will always have to address. So let me give you an example, and it's coming from permaculture, and this is my own house that we worked on, right? So permaculture is permanent agriculture or permanent culture, and it's a concept that is put into play usually for agriculture, but also increasingly for those who are wanting to live sustainably and treat more lightly on the earth, right? So just as an example, let's pick the roofscape of a city, my city, Bengaluru. If you look at it, the roof from a Google Earth photograph, this is what you see, right? The 65% of the city in densely populated areas, 65% to 70% are just roofscapes. About another 15 to 20% are roads. So in the combination of roofs and roads, we are covering the whole built form and crusting up the city, right? And so the roofs are themselves sterile, uninteresting, and heat sinks because they're badly designed, yet they receive almost all of the rain, sun, wind, and life, right? Everything is endowed mostly on the roof itself. And this is how rooftops are in most places, just places as a byproduct of the design of the building itself. So the question one asks oneself is, can it solve a city's water, stormwater, energy, wastewater, food, and biodiversity problem? Can we design roofs? Can we design spaces to partially address, if not completely address, a city's problems in sourcing water, in managing floods, in managing energy requirements, in managing the waste streams that emerge from the houses and buildings, to grow the food that is necessary for living in the city, and to address the issues of biodiversity loss in the city? So one of the examples that I use is this: how about a roof that grows rice, right? So rice paddy. So on the rooftop, you can layer about 3 inches of compost or soil, and then you can grow paddy itself, right? And why paddy? Why not? Is a question that one asks, because paddy is one of the staple diets of the grains of South India, and it's supposed to be a water-intensive crop, but it's also traditionally tied to the agricultural practices of our region, and therefore it's culturally embedded in terms of cultivation. So here's how paddy is growing on top of a rooftop, and it can be a very good lush space. And you'll see again that the two women who are working on it are construction workers who come during the non-rice, non-cultivation season in Tamil Nadu to Bangalore city to work on construction, and they're very happy to engage with paddy because that's something which they're familiar with. So how do we tie livelihoods with migration and integrate it as part of a city's fabric of design and development? So here's paddy being harvested, cultivated. The paddy uses only treated grey water, right? So in terms of the modern conveniences, what we do is use the washing machine water, the bath water, collect it and treat it using reeds and bulrushes and clean it up from the phosphates and detergents and soaps that are there and push it into the paddy for cultivation. And you use a system called ecological sanitation. Some of you may be familiar that toilets generate the wastewater, which then ends up polluting our rivers and streams. But if you just separate urine and feces, perhaps you have a design solution to manage urine, which is very rich in, as a fertilizer and as a nutrient, feces, which has a lot of bacteria, but which, if composted, can also be a fertilizer for farms. So 85% of the nutrients is in urine, and it's very easy to segregate urine, dilute it, and apply it to plants. Only thing is you have to realize that you need about 40 square meters of agricultural space for one human being's urine to be completely absorbed in that particular agricultural land, right? So as a design facilitation, what you do is you design these EcoSan pans, which are source separating pans, and there's a lot of design endeavor here, which you then incorporate as part of your building design and make sure that the urine and feces are separated, and then you collect them separately in a box and in a barrel. And you do the design as an architect to do the dry toilet, composting toilet separately, and the grey water collection separately, so that all of them are brought to productive use. You use kitchen composters to compost all the biodegradables from the kitchen, and nothing goes outside the home. And then what you then realize is, in terms of the demand of fresh water, there's a dramatic drop, almost a 100% drop when you use EcoSan and grey water recycling as opposed to conventional systems, right? And so then you harvest rain on the rooftop. You make sure that all the rooftop rainwater is collected. In this particular case, used also for drinking and cooking. You keep the roof catchment clean just before the rainy season. And then from 100 square meter, depending on the rainfall in your particular city, in Bangalore, you're able to collect 97,000 liters of rainwater, which is good enough for 325 days of freshwater demand, right? And then you use the sun for energy requirements. So you use solar cookers, you use solar photovoltaics, solar water heaters to capture all the energy that falls on the roof and then meet the demand of energy in the house, the energy demand for cooking, for water heating, and for lighting and for cooling purposes, right? And then as you design it, you design for biodiversity. So now if you make the roof green and you have the right kind of plant biodiversity, you'll find a lot of birds and owls like this also coming there. So the roof then becomes a biodiversity spot, which includes providing water for doves to come during summertime, small things like that, right, as part of the design. The scops owl, which likes a bit of shade and no light, so you can design with Singapore cherry trees so that the owl also comes back. And then you design in such a fashion like Chitra does and our team at Biome does, is where you incorporate a basement which provides all the earth for the construction of the whole building, right? So the basement becomes a cool space to occupy during summer, and the material for the construction of the house is coming from the site itself. Now, this is the notion of independency that we are working on. We can be independent as a plot if we use material from the plot for construction, if you harvest the rainwater, if you use solar energy, and if you recycle grey water and wastewater, right? And so this is how it looks like from the below, the rooftop. It can all be designed. So 100 square meter roof area in the Bangalore context as a design intervention can produce 100,000 liters of water. You can grow 200 kgs of rice and vegetables in a year. All the grey water, bath water and washing machine water can be generated, will be consumed. All the toilet waste can be consumed in the space. It can provide biodiversity for 32 different species of birds, and you can heat 100 liters of water daily, light 12 bulbs, and cook for yourself, right? So this is a kind of design intervention you can do with a small limited space. And therefore, it can provide us food security, water security, energy security, waste security, and ecological security, right? This is how a design intervention looks. Now, the question to ask is, how much should we push this kind of a design? If I become completely independent from the city, will I be bothered about what the city is undergoing in terms of the problems it has? And will I, as an individual, be connected to the community to help the community overcome its problems or not? The president of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, had a famous saying. When Singapore wanted to be independent of water from Malaysia, it used to take a lot of water from Malaysia, it continues to do a bit. Lee Kuan Yew said, look, we will continue to take a little bit of water from Malaysia because it will teach us humility. When we are dependent on our neighbors for something as a livelihood, then our relationship with that neighbor is different than if we are completely independent. Independence can lead to arrogance, and therefore this connect with the community should be part of our social design and part of our ecological design fabrics, right? And so I'll come to that. Now, the city of Bangalore is faced with a water scarcity situation, right? So Niti Aayog and other think tanks report that Bangalore will run out of groundwater, actually run out of groundwater by 2020 itself. Then you look around the city itself. Look at people, when you have conversations, you find people like Muniappa here, or Shankar and Ramakrishna as on the right. These are from a traditional community of well diggers called the Manvatars. These people have been digging the tanks and wells that I showed you in the previous slides for 1,200 years. They're an itinerant community. They migrate, they used to at points of time, and they've dug wells from Kashmir, Rajasthan, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, all the way to Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Can they become a part of the solution for the city's water scarcity? Well, look at what cities have done to water bodies otherwise. This is Agrasen Ki Baudi in Delhi. You see that the water level is so high as per the famous picture by Raghu Rai. And this is how the step well looks like. So we preserved the heritage. The skeleton is there. The soul is lost. Yeah. So is there a way in which we can make citizens aware of the need to bring back the groundwater table and the aquifers to be full so that the whole heritage value of the step well itself is completely regenerated? So here's what the Manvatars in Bangalore do. They design or they dig what are called recharge wells. Here you see them just below that. That's about 30 feet deep, 3 feet in diameter, 1 meter in diameter, about 10 meters deep. This is the earth that they get from the various sites that they have, beautiful colored earth representing the geology and the time history of the city. And then people like Mr. Balasubramaniam pick their rooftop rainwater in the pipe that you see, push it through the blue drum and push it into the well and make sure that all the rooftop rainwater goes into this recharge well. Now, given good conditions of the aquifer in many parts of the city, the groundwater table comes up and the well itself becomes the provider of water to Mr. Balasubramaniam throughout the year, right? So we have regenerated the aquifer, provided livelihoods to well diggers, and prevented urban flooding in Bangalore and made Bangalore that much more water secure. So here's one more well in the basement. The rooftop water is going into the well, and that well provides water throughout the year, right? So by a combination of various kinds of recharge wells, which are modern designs to recharge bore wells and to recharge open wells, by using the livelihoods of the traditional well digging community, and by communitizing water, by making sure that every house or plot in this gated community does recharge, and only 2 or 3 of them draw water. Communitizing water, you are able to ban the privatization of water and communitize the wells, redesign stormwater drains to pick up road runoff, filter it and push it into the aquifer so that it recharges the aquifer and does not flood, like so, redesigning many of our storm drains using recharge wells, cleaning up old wells like you see on the right, which this community has removed 120 truckloads of silt and made sure that there is recharge so that the well springs back to life, the aquifer springs back to life. And in the process of livelihood generation, livelihoods through maintenance of these wells, you're getting more and more water security for the city of Bangalore. Yeah. So again, traditional well digging community, traditional livelihoods as a form of harvesting rainwater, and livelihoods as a form of ecological security. What about at a watershed level? I just move to the next level of fishers, right? Fishermen, as they used to be called, but now a general neutral term is fishers, as ecological regenerators of ecosystems. How does that work? Let's look at the lay of the land. This is again Bangalore city. You see that there are 3 major valleys, and in each valley there's a major watershed with a lake or a tank, right? And this lake, which you see on the top right, is a lake called Jakkur, which has about 19 square kilometers, right, of catchment area. This is how Jakkur Lake looks like, 50 hectares of water spread. And you see that the brown circular thing there, just below the brown patch there, that is a wastewater treatment plant or a sewage treatment plant. It's important to locate the sewage treatment plant appropriately, like so. This is a 15 million liter per day sewage treatment plant, which picks up all the sewage in the neighborhood, makes sure that it comes here, is treated. The sewage treatment plant itself has a lot of sludge. The sludge sells for 10,000 rupees a truckload. It generates roughly 2 truckloads a day. And it helps service farmers up to 300 kilometers away who use the sludge as fertilizer for their coconut and areca nut, right? And then the treated wastewater with technology is able to treat water to a great level of cleanliness, right? As you see on the right. Then this treated wastewater comes in through a constructed wetland. A constructed wetland is a space in the lake which further polishes the water, which takes away more nutrients from it, nitrates and phosphate, and cleans it up further. The constructed wetland itself is a huge biodiversity space because of the wide variety of plants, mammals, reptiles, and birds which occupies the space, like the weaver bird, right, which you see here. And the constructed wetland not only is a biodiversity space, it's also a space for livelihoods, as I'll show to you, and a polisher of the wastewater. It polishes the sewage. Some amount of untreated sewage is also cleaned up by this wastewater. And you see that the water which leaves the constructed wetland into the lake is very, very clean. Nature is doing its job of cleaning the waters. And this is how the lake looks like, full of treated wastewater. Yeah, it's regenerated. And the lake is now providing livelihoods to fishermen. So fishermen cultivate fish in the lake. They harvest about 200 to 250 kgs of fish, depending on the time of the year and the quality of the lake water. And this fish is providing nutrients for the city, proteins for the city, as you can see, and livelihoods for a fishermen's cooperative. The fishermen's cooperative has about 98 members, so 98 families are feeding of the treated wastewater, which is filling Jakkur Lake. The fishermen not only make sure that they harvest the fish, they take care of the fish, but also they make sure that the water hyacinth, if it proliferates, is removed from the lake regularly because it helps the lake to cultivate more fish, right? So fishermen have a stake in keeping water hyacinths away from the lake. So it's crucial for that. And this lake and wetland also provides for grass cutters. There's a particular grass called alligator grass, Hongorne soppu in Canada, which is taken by these cattle rearers who have cows in their homes. They come and harvest daily. They keep the mass balance of the wetlands, and they make sure that the cows get the feed. And this is for free. This is the commons, the use of the commons. The wetlands as the commons, right? So that's what happens. As you can see, this particular person is harvesting the grass from the fringe of the lake, and it does that every day. Roughly about 250 to 300 cows are fed from the grass which Jakkur lakes, wetlands, and fringes provide, right? And in the process of regeneration, what happens is nature comes back. The painted stork, the pelicans, there are more than 200 to 250 painted storks at particular points of time of the year. And Jakkur Lake has now become the third or fourth highest biodiversity spot in the city. So what you've done is, through a form of intervention with technology, of livelihoods of fishermen, and of nature working, you have regenerated an ecosystem and made sure that the water is becoming re-available to the city through groundwater. So the lake water recharges the aquifer, and now this is drinking water for the city. Wastewater has been transformed to drinking water, right? So these are kind of interventions which now urban India especially needs, and rural India will need in the immediate future, where livelihoods and ecological regeneration are both merged as part of design. So let me come to the last argument that I make. Cities and urban areas are usually seen as net consumers of the ecosystem, of the environment, right? They consume a lot of natural resources, let's say in the form of water, sand, food, everything else, and they let out a lot of pollution, right? So streams of waste, solid waste, streams of wastewater flows from cities, and they end up polluting the hinterland. So cities, can they be reimagined as water and fertilizer factories, right? Can they be seen as net providers of water and cities, right? So what's happening in the city of Bangalore? We have something like 38 sewage treatment plants now. 38 sewage treatment plants treating 1,440 million liters of water every day, right? And so this is how the sewage treatment plants looks like. So all the wastewater is picked up now and is treated to secondary standards. And from these 38 sewage treatment plants, the treated wastewater is pumped about 50 to 70 kilometers and fills 137 lakes in the dry arid district of Kolar. You see one lake here to the left, water is filling that lake. Then the water cascades down, as on the photograph on the right, and fills the next lake by gravity. Like that, a chain of 7 to 10 lakes are fed. Then from the 10th lake, again, the water is pumped to the next higher lake, and again, it cascades down. 137 lakes have already been filled. Another 250 lakes will be filled in Kolar district alone. Like that, another 200 lakes are being filled in Chikballapur district, which is to the north of Bangalore city. And overall, the whole semi-arid hinterland of Bangalore is being revived using treated wastewater from Bangalore. Yeah. So this is a form by which you can see the tanks are full throughout the year. There's a regeneration of groundwater, and there's a regeneration of biodiversity and fish in these lakes. That's happening all across, right? So just to give you examples, on the left is a photograph of another pumping station, the blue and white stripes, which fills up the lake. So these lakes are becoming wetlands, biodiversity spaces, and providing food security, water security to farmers. And therefore, when the farmers cultivate food, it becomes food security for the city, right? What you see is the lakes receiving water, and to the right is a photograph where fishermen are cultivating fish in one of the first lakes, which is receiving treated wastewater. Now, farmers are not allowed to take the treated wastewater directly from the lake. It recharges the groundwater, and from the wells and bore wells, which are then filled, farmers use the water and use it to grow cucumber, every kind of vegetable that is possible there, because this is certified as good enough to be reused for even edible crops, right? Unlike the case of Vijaypura, where it was used for non-edible purposes. So the city itself now is a net provider of water and fertilizer to its hinterland, in turn ensuring livelihood security for farmers and food security for itself. So what does this tell us, right, in terms of a design intervention? What it tells us is that we as designers, we as architects, we as people who intervene with communities should have an adaptive framework. And what are the 7 ways to do adaptive framework? This again, I pick up from the web. So if the solution requires operating in a different way than what you do now, you may be facing an adaptive challenge, right? If the problem and the solution require learning, and that's constant learning, you may be facing an adaptive challenge, right? Remember that learning means conversations with fishers, well diggers, farmers, you name it, those whose livelihoods are dependent on it. Therefore, that's how the learning happens. If the solution requires shifting the authority and responsibility to the people who are actually affected or benefited, you may be facing an adaptive challenge. If the solution requires some sacrifice of your past ways of working or living, you may be facing an adaptive challenge. If the solution requires experimentation and you're not sure of the answer, you may be facing an adaptive challenge. If the solution will take a long time, you may be facing an adaptive challenge. If the challenge connects to people's deeply held values, you may be facing an adaptive challenge, right? So this framework, which I will leave with you, is something to mull over. It is important for us in any form of design to use this adaptive management framework in a very dynamic world that we occupy. There's the second approach, which I will leave with you. This is the approach of the commons. Famous Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostroms. And she talks about these 13 frameworks. So she says, think about institutions. Create institutions at the lowest possible level that's possible, that can operate, right? Like a Gram Panchayat is the best institution to manage the affairs of a village. Or a Nagar Panchayat is the best institution to manage the affairs of a city. Higher level institutions tend to be distanced from people, not to empower people. Therefore, we should look at decentralized institutions. Post-social changes, problem solving. Try to construct it as a social problem solving effort. Embrace diversity. There's not one solution, right? There are many, many forms of solution. Standardization does not help us easily. Diversity is the key. But be specific in that particular context. When you embrace diversity, when you go to Jakkur Lake, work on being specific to Jakkur Lake and what the people of Jakkur Lake do, right? Listen to people. And this is very, very important. Constantly listen, constantly allow for listening, not just in terms of words, but in assimilating the ideas and solutions that people are bringing. Self-government is possible. Everything changes, right? None of these solutions are permanent. Everything changes. So we have to change with the changing context, societal context, economic context, environmental context. Map power. Power and getting power to be more equal, like in the case of the Dalit women who are rehabilitating the tanks in Kolar, is crucial. Power acts itself as patriarchy, as gender, class, caste in many ways. We must map and understand power at every point of time. Collective ownership can work. Human beings are part of nature too. All institutions are constructed, so can be constructed differently. No panaceas. And complexity is the name of the game. It does not mean chaos, but don't think that there are simple solutions for everything. Complexity is also crucial to be managing, right? Because this is a great journey we are upon. This is a journey of what we call water literacy, ecological literacy, design literacy, and social literacy. And in this journey, there's no stopping for the knowledge that we will have to accumulate, the knowledge that we will have to put to bear with society and people and individuals, and the knowledge which will seek justice and equity as its end goal, right? So that that is the fundamental crux by which interventions will do, because the only thing we learn from history is that we do not learn from history. That's not something that we need to do. We need to learn to be adaptive and to work along with it. So the one planet that we have, and the only thing that we need to take care of, right, in our lifetimes, as we are given the opportunity to work. So thank you for your patient hearing, and if there's any discussion, I'd be happy to take it.
Thank you, Professor Vishwanath. It was such a wonderful talk. And okay. So it was such a wonderful talk, and with such extensive and valuable insights on what, where, when, and how our sensitivities to the ecologies around us can be. It was really amazing to have you here, and I'm sure the Q&A session that will follow will equally enlighten us about the awareness one must have towards one's context. We now move on to an interactive session, a Q&A session from the Avani community, where students and faculties at large have attempted to engage with the idea that Professor Vishwanath has been presenting. This will happen in the form of questions and conversations. We have a few questions from the faculties and students. So, sir, with your permission, should I go ahead?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you so much. So the first question that has been put up is, architecture is often about a final defined product and final clean design. While working with unpredictable and ephemeral landscapes, especially water landscapes, how can architects engage in a new practice methodology?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because it's also a relationship with the client that we have, right? So there's a time deadline, there's a product deadline, and we're done and dusted with the product which we deliver, and then we move on usually. How do we embrace impermanence is a big challenge for us. It may be that we must design for using the adaptive framework so that the buildings or the constructions we leave behind are capable of absorbing the dynamic changes that they're most likely to face, right? And there's no easy answer for that. There's no easy answer for that. It's something that we learn. And we see increasingly that the life cycle of buildings are getting shorter and shorter. So therefore, how do we, for example, make sure that the buildings can themselves be completely recycled at the end of that life cycle is one approach. How can they be moved in certain fashions within? How can spaces be transformed within so that more adaptive use can occur if the use itself changes, right? Or if the requirement changes. Now, in this day and age of COVID, you learn that large university campuses are hollow structures when classes have gone online, right? And those systems and those spaces have not been designed for online classes. So how do we engage with it? It's a constant challenge, no easy answers, but we have to keep working at it and thinking about it. Did I lose you guys? Sorry about that. I think I lost you for some time, for a minute.
Yeah, I think there was a connection issue. So please continue.
Correct, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. So that's about it. So it's a challenging task, and there's no easy answer for you guys with an architectural product.
Yeah. So I move on to the next question then, sir.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So most often we see water bodies in cities that are meant to be important commons, cordoned off from human interaction and use. Local governments lay down several regulations in using these water bodies, providing livelihoods or for entertainment. This leads to neglect and loss of value. How do you think we can bring life to these water bodies without distancing people from it? What are the strategies that can make people important stakeholders?
So for me, there's no generic answer for it. There's an answer for a particular context and a particular lake, right? So I'll just give you that example which I showed to you about Jakkur Lake, right? Now, there's a sort of a middle classization or a middle class capture of the imagination of water bodies in cities. In Jakkur too, the middle class people who are residents now and who are the dominant stakeholders thought that it was recreational in terms of its use, right? So that people could walk around, jog around, cycle around, and enjoy the views with some music performances, song performances, and so on there, right? But livelihoods as a concept for the lake was not there in the middle class head. A series of conversations then led to the fact that both of them could coexist, right? So the fishers, the grass cutters are also entitled to the commons, and because their livelihood is at stake. Whereas the entertainment value or the recreational value that a lake brings is perhaps of secondary importance. So these kind of conversations are essential for every water body to arrive at a consensus as to how do we make sure that that the functionality of that water body is maintained through a practice of livelihood. Those who have a skin in the game, those whose stake is the highest, are the ones who are most likely to maintain or manage it, right? For the middle class, it's not a livelihood issue, right? It's just a recreational issue. And then it becomes that much more difficult for them to invest to make sure that these water bodies are clean and are kept in a pristine condition. So this is a struggle that will have to be addressed individually for each water body. The canals of Alipi, for example, or the canals in the backwaters in Kerala, for example, the Ashtamudi Lake, for example. Each one of these water bodies will have to face its own challenges and try to find solutions for itself. No template for you guys.
Yeah, even I completely agree, sir. Like, for example, you said the livelihood must be like it's almost inseparable for certain sections of society, the idea of water, how they use it. And as we move up towards the pyramid, it sort of morphs into this more recreational value. So I think as soon as we identify those symbiotic sections of the society, we will be able to have a very direct approach at a stakeholder level discussion with those communities. So, yeah. So, sir, moving on to the next question, we have two more questions. Kerala has a fragile ecosystem, which these days are affected by floods. While several chunks of land gets flooded during monsoons, many natural drains are clogged from waste. How can we assess the cost of flood damage when the environmental damage cost is very high? What can planners do to avoid this?
So here's the thing. It's a tough one for people from Kerala. Just read up the Madhav Gadgil committee report, right? Madhav Gadgil committee has looked at the fragility of the landscape of the entire Western Ghats, including Kerala, right? And has identified vulnerable zones and identified the likely causes, places where landslide will occur, floods will occur, because these zones are very sensitive, right? And they've also offered solutions. The solutions that they offered was decentralization, that these ecologically sensitive spots should be managed through a decentralized consultative process. Unfortunately, they run against powerful lobbies, which derive a lot of benefits from the destruction of the Ghats, right? And it's not being politically possible to accommodate the Madhav Gadgil committee report. But do familiarize yourself with that report. It's there on the web. You can download it and read it up. And the solution lies in that space. Decentralization of power, more decision-making at local levels, more regulation of those large-scale destructors like mining and, let's say, plantations, and more control on these, especially the ecological sensitive spots. There is no walking away from it.
Yeah. For example, not just in Kerala, similar situation is always observed also in Chennai and also in Assam, for that fact. So, like, there's no fixed regulation to kind of impose a degree of control there, while we keep speculating, sitting inside our rooms, but then there's no real discussion that is happening regarding that. Like, I'm sure the report that you were mentioning regarding the Kerala's, regarding the impositions that have been put up in Kerala, I think they will be able to give us valuable insights on the particular question that has been asked.
It's one of the best reports of ecological sensitive zones, and it's beautifully frameworked and worked upon, and it's worth the lesson for students to learn how to conceptualize ecologically sensitive zones and how to think of dealing with it from a governance framework, right? So that's the Madhav Gadgil committee report. Do read up about it.
Sure, yes. I hope the students are noting that down. Okay, so we move on to the next one, the final question. Now, there are several lakes designed by architects, man-made lakes. There's the Kakaria Lake, for example. Now, how can designed lakes become commons? How can we ensure stakeholder participation in those?
Now, that's a difficult one. You know, urban lakes, especially, let's say, for example, in Bangalore, and Kakaria is the Ahmedabad version of it, were originally designed, as the inscription stones tell us and as history tells us, for irrigation, right? So you held the water and you used the water for agriculture in the command area. Once urbanization comes in, that command area is destroyed, there's no agriculture, and the very reason why these tanks and lakes were built is lost. There's no reason for it to exist now. So the new reason has to be found has to be discovered and identified by local communities, right? So you have to figure out whether you place enough importance on biodiversity. If you do so, then you will design this as wetlands and as places of biodiversity, like the painted storks and the pelicans in Jakur Lake, for example, for space for that. Or you can design it for fishing. You can say that livelihoods of fishermen will be ensured, and therefore the onus of maintaining the lake will be with the fishermen, and whatever fishes come, the money will go to the fishermen, right? So you work on that. So lakes can also be treated wastewater recipients, right? Now, in the case of treated wastewater, there's a famous principle called the polluter pays. So the citizens of Bangalore have to pay for the cost of treatment of wastewater, and the treated wastewater has to be of sufficient quality so that it can fill the lake and keep it full all the time, right? And not eutrophy or not have algae in it. So if the citizens are willing to pay that money, then treated wastewater can be a good source of filling up these lakes. So a whole combination of understanding of the lake will have to be generated, new users identified, livelihoods identified, and then converged with the maintenance of the lake.
Yeah, I think Sukhna is also a good example for that. It was created as a reservoir for
Sukhna was designed as a drinking water source for Chandigarh.
Yeah. Like from the Shiva lakes, the streams came down, so they made it into a rain-fed lake.
Correct.
Yeah. So, sir, thank you so much. But in the okay, sir, if you don't mind, there are, in fact, because of in the interest of your wonderful presentation, we have some impromptu questions as well.
Please go ahead.
So, students, please raise your hands, and one by one, maybe we can go take a few questions. S9 students especially. Am I audible to you guys? S9 students. Okay, I guess there's a connection issue. We'll move on with that because in the so please continue.
If people have an issue, they can put it on chat, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. If there's a voice issue, guys, please put your questions up in the chat so that sir can see them and we can have a discussion over that. I think they got disconnected. They were here. Anyway. So, so in the interest of time, I think there were more questions, but we'll be sure to form a repository of those inquiries and questions, and maybe we can share it with Professor Vishwanath for his insights later on.
Yeah, you're welcome to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that will be great. So now moving on towards the end of the event, it gives me immense pleasure to extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Vishwanath for his enlightening lecture. Reading and listening to you has always encouraged new perspectives and has often shaped one's critical engagements with their environment. I'm confident that this session has impacted our students and faculty alike to reflect on their sensitivities to our ecologies, waters, and contexts. We hope to host you on campus soon, sir, one day, for a further engagement with the Avani community in generating awareness towards our waters contexts. I wish to take this opportunity to thank Architect Tony Joseph and the GC for their constant support and encouragement, and my colleagues and students for their rigorous engagements within the academy. Special thanks to the curators, the entire BVBA team, student volunteers, the graphics team, admin and IT team for organizing this event. I hope all the students have gained immensely from Zen Rainman's beautiful insights. Thank you all for your participation and wishing you all and Professor Vishwanath a very, very good evening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck in your journey.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.